In section 224 of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche discusses the historical sense in more detail. He calls it the capacity for quickly guessing the order of rank of the valuations according to which a people, a society, a human being has lived. So we can think of the historical sense as a kind of appreciation for the different moralities, the different moral codes that different peoples at different places and times have had. It is unique to the 19th century, Nietzsche says, and it follows from the semi-barbarism into which Europeans have slipped following a century or more of the mixing of nations and peoples and classes. This democratic spirit has brought about a state of humanity in which we have this historical sense. We are no longer noble peoples with their own codes, but we are, he says, we ourselves are a kind of chaos. We are, therefore, the recipients of the past in the way that no noble ages ever were. This historical sense seems to be something new in the modern age. This opens unique possibilities to us, however. In this moment, as modern people, we have access to all these semi-barbaric cultures of the past. And because nothing is ours, also nothing is off limits to us, so we can evaluate and appropriate elements of the past the way that noble cultures could not. Another way of putting it is that our ignoble age can have a taste for everything, unlike noble ages of the past. Each age, each noble class would have its own strongly defined sense of taste. It would accept or reject the foreign based upon what met its taste. We have no taste as modern people. Nietzsche lists some of our virtues, in keeping with the title of this part. We are, he says, unpretentious, selfless, modest, courageous, full of self-overcoming, full of devotion, very grateful, very patient, and very accommodating, but we do not have good taste. We cannot appreciate the fullness or the maturity of a past age's full self-realization. We might say we're not able to turn the dial all the way up to 100 for any particular past glorious age, but we make up for this in breadth. We have access to many different ages. For us, Nietzsche says, it is the infinite, the unmeasured, and the dangerous that drives our society and that drives our sense of self as moderns. In the next section, Nietzsche discusses the value of suffering, and he begins by listing some ethical isms, utilitarianism and the like, which measure value in terms of pleasure and pain. Unfortunately, for them, pleasure and pain are secondary phenomena. Nietzsche says we, I think meaning we philosophers of the future, we who are conscious of our creative power, look down on these considerations of pleasure and pain. And we have, he says, our own pity, but our pity is different from your pity, the pity of the utilitarians. It is not pity with society or pity with the unfortunate. It is not pity with the restless rabble longing to assert itself to remake society along democratic lines. Our pity, he says, is lighter and more far-sighted. It is pity for the self-imposed smallness of modern man. Still addressing the moderns and the utilitarians, Nietzsche says, we find your seriousness more dangerous than any frivolity. And why is this? It is because you want to abolish suffering, this monstrous goal of yours. Now, to you, we immoralists, we philosophers of the future, Nietzsche says, we seem to value suffering. We seem to want more suffering in the world. But it certainly is the case that we want no part of what you call well-being, regardless whether that is eudaimonistic or utilitarian in nature. So Nietzsche here praises the discipline of great suffering, and he does so in an expression that he will repeat almost verbatim at the beginning of Part 9 in section 257. He writes here, the discipline of suffering, of great suffering, do you not know that only this discipline has created all enhancements of man so far? So the progress of the human race, of the type man, its elevation to greater spiritual heights, this does not come through the relief of suffering. This comes through the imposition of the discipline of suffering, We might think of this as a kind of internal tension within the soul or within even an entire society, like the tension contained in a bent bow, to use an image that we also see in Zarathustra's prologue. In the second half of section 225, Nietzsche uses a metaphor that I think is quite important for understanding 20th century existentialism. He says, in man, creature and creator are united. I think along these same lines, I think of a phrase that I remember from long ago from one of my teachers, that man is an artist and his greatest work of art is himself. So we are both creator and created. But Nietzsche uses this image to deepen the contrast between his pity and the pity of the utilitarians. He says, your pity is for the creature in man, for the part of man that must be broken, for the raw material, the thing that must be changed and must suffer. Our pity, he doesn't say outright, but implies, our pity is for the creator in man, for the creative self, for the one that is doing the breaking and remaking of a new self, a higher self. And this is the key element, I think, of Nietzsche's higher ethics, which is above considerations of pleasure and pain. I'll pass over the next two sections fairly quickly. In section 226, Nietzsche simply contrasts the work of we immoralists with the clumsy dolts who dwell on appearances in the modern world and contemporary society. And in section 227, he speaks about honesty, not for the first or last time, with a kind of ironic praise. He talks about our honesty, which he associates with our devilry, which he suggests we will put into opposition to the holiness of our opponents, to their godliness. And he talks about our disgust with what is clumsy and approximate, our adventurous courage, our seasoned and choosy curiosity, our subtlest, most disguised, most spiritual will to power and overcoming of the world. All of these I think we can add to the list of our virtues that he's compiling in this part. Section 228 opens by noting that all moral philosophy so far has been boring and soporific, and he specifically here is attacking the utilitarians. Nietzsche is in rare form here with his wit. He writes, "It is important that as few people as possible should think about morality. Hence it is very important that morality should not one day become interesting. But there is no reason for worry." In other words, the contemporary moral philosophers, the utilitarians, are in no danger of actually making morality into a topic of interest for the masses. Moral philosophy in Europe today is boring and safe. It lacks any sense of danger, and more importantly, it lacks any sense of calamity. We might think again here about the contrast with the madmen passage in The Gay Science, or Zarathustra's prologue, the sense of doom, the sense of moral catastrophe that is impending upon Europe. The utilitarians and other contemporary moral philosophers, Nietzsche says, seem to be more like technicians working on a machine, adjusting a nut or a belt here, trying to find small improvements in efficiency to improve the overall functioning of the machine. They have no idea that the machine itself is shortly to be destroyed. He connects this as well, I think, with what we might call the English assumption that all virtue, always and everywhere, has always been about people striving for English-style comfort, for, a warm hearth and a full cellar and a barrel of beer. And this is enough comfort for anyone. What more could anyone possibly want? Nietzsche says these moral philosophers cannot imagine that what is good for one is not good for all. What's good for one person is not good for all people. What's good for one nation or class may not be good for all nations and classes. They miss the fact that there is an order of rank between men and between moralities. Another iteration of this key element in Nietzsche's thought of the order of rank. In the next section, Nietzsche praises cruelty. He says almost anything that we call higher culture is based on the spiritualization of cruelty. In art, both the tragic and the sublime depend upon some element of cruelty. But it is an error of modern psychologists to assume that cruelty involves enjoying only the suffering of others. Cruelty, he says, is possible in enjoying one's own suffering. I think we can connect this to the idea of creator and created in a previous section, that there is a sense in which spiritual and moral progress even requires the self-discipline of being cruel and hard with oneself. And so I want to emphasize this praise of cruelty, I think, is praise of an inward-directed cruelty primarily. Even the seeker after knowledge, Nietzsche says, must work against the inclination of his spirit. His spirit would rather remain ignorant, would rather remain self-indulgent. In a sense, we have to force ourselves to seek knowledge, to find what is there. In all desire to know, he writes, there is a drop of cruelty. In section 230, the last section I'll talk about in this video, Nietzsche takes up and explains further a concept he introduced at the end of the previous section, this idea of the will of the spirit. I think what he is getting at here are different elements of the will to power, different kinds of drives or will within a single individual, within a single culture or society. There is first, and maybe primary, the will to mastery of one's environment, the will to be master in one's own house, he says, and most especially to feel oneself to be master. This is the sort of domineering drive that is part of the life force of all living things. He calls it the will to simplify. In order to incorporate the foreign into itself, then the self will sometimes falsify or will sort of separate out and be selective about what it incorporates. It will disregard what is uncongenial to it. This is the will of the part of the will of the spirit that values growth, and especially the feeling of growth, the sort of waxing of the self. There is an opposite drive to this, however. This is the will to exclude, the will to shut oneself off, to be defensive, the will even to embrace ignorance. Nietzsche connects this also with a kind of digestion. This seems to be proportional to the previous will. There's a will to mastery, which incorporates, and a will to exclusion, which incorporates and digests. And it's here in this latter drive that we find the occasional will of the spirit to let itself be deceived, to allow ourselves to go along with a story that we know is not in fact so. Also here we find the spirit of dissimulation, the willingness to deceive others. This is the part of the self, the drive within the self that enjoys wearing masks, and that constitutes our creative power. It is, we might say, the will to mere appearance, the will to simplification, to the wearing of masks, to dwelling upon the surface, as opposed to the will to truth, the will to profundity, to multiplicity, to thoroughness, and this is associated with the cruelty that was mentioned earlier. Nietzsche then returns here to the idea that the knowledge seeker requires above all a kind of self-discipline. He says, it would sound nicer for us if we were to call this cruelty honesty, but, he says, we free spirits, we philosophers of the future, don't need this kind of verbal pomp. We don't need to dress up our inner cruelty in the language of this virtue. In the penultimate paragraph of this part, Nietzsche gives us, I think, an interesting indication of where he's going with the rest of the book. So I'd like to share that with you right now, and here it is. To translate man back into nature, to become master over the many vain and overly enthusiastic interpretations and connotations that have so far been scrawled and painted over that eternal basic text of Homo Natura, to see to it that man henceforth stands before man as even today, hardened in the discipline of science, he stands before the rest of nature, with intrepid Oedipus eyes and sealed Odysseus ears, deaf to the siren songs of old metaphysical bird-catchers who have been piping at him all too long. You are more, you are higher, you are of a different origin. That may be a strange and insane task, but it is a task. Who would deny that? Why did we choose this insane task? Or putting it differently, why have knowledge at all? Nietzsche here is talking about man's mastery over man and his self-understanding. He's comparing it to the superiority man already feels to nature, suggesting that man will shortly have this superiority with respect to himself. There's the troubling mention of Oedipus' eyes, suggesting a kind of violence and blindness, but also of sealed Odysseus' ears, stopping up our ears against the siren song of the metaphysicians who would say, man is higher, man is better than the natural world, than the animal world from which he comes. Nietzsche calls this task strange and insane, and suggests this really is where he is going with the rest of the book, with the rest of this project. Why have knowledge at all? He says in the final paragraph, then, everybody will ask us that, and we, pressed this way, we who have put the same question to ourselves 100 times, we have found and find no better answer. ... He leaves that off, and so that's for the remainder of the book. But an indication here, I think, at the end of section 230 of just what Nietzsche is up to at this point in the text. That's all for now. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.